Welcome to GRN, the Growth and Resilience Network, where every episode brings you targeted stories and strategies for professional growth and personal resilience. I'm Steve Piscitelli, your host, coming to you from my headquarters, my world headquarters here in Atlantic Beach, Florida. You know, in 2012, the Higher Education Research Institute conducted a survey that looked at job stress and burnout. One intriguing finding was something the survey labeled as presenteeism. You've heard of absenteeism, staying home from work for whatever reason. For those guilty of presenteeism, they actually come to work and then phone in their performance. They simply just go through the motions. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health defines job stress as, quote, the harmful physical and emotional responses that occur when the requirements of the job do not match the capabilities, resources, or needs of the worker. Job stress can lead to poor health and even injury, end of quote. So how does one maintain the fire, even if it's just a spark, over the years in a job, a career, a profession? Yeah, how do we keep the wow in what we do each day? I bet if you look around, you can easily point to one or two friends or colleagues who never seem to tire of what they do. Even in the toughest of times, they always seem to be juiced for a new day and a new challenge. And where do they find this reservoir of optimism? You know, for me, I really had to go no further than the morning paper here in Jacksonville, Florida, the Florida Times-Union. And just look at one of the feature writers there, who also happens to be a neighbor and a friend. Every time one of his pieces appears in the paper, I think to myself, how does he stay so fresh? Where does Matt get those ideas? Is he just more creative than the average person, or is he just hungrier? Is it part of his DNA? And I also think, can we apply these strategies that he, I think, has? Can we apply them to other walks of life? So with us today is Matt Soergel. He's a reporter, as I said, for the Florida Times-Union in Jacksonville. If you go to jacksonville.com, you can find his work. He has been there since 1990 with that paper, and he, before that, plied his craft in New England and in Denver. He has degrees from Westmont College and Boston University. And he is a recognized journalist. He's got the Morris Journalism Excellence Award for writing over the last 2 years, 2013 and 14, plus some state awards for feature writing and for his work as a movie critic, which I'm sure we'll probably move into that at some point during tonight's discussion. So let's welcome to the GRN studio, Mr. Matt Soergel. Matt, welcome, my friend.
Thank you, Steve.
It is good to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Let's start with just a little context for our listeners. You're a reporter. Mm-hmm. You're a feature writer. You've been a movie critic. Tell us a little bit about what you do. What is that?
Just reflecting life in this area, in the feature writing and the news writing. The newspapers are really, they call them the first draft of history, and they really are. They tell what's going on in the community, and it's up to us to reflect that, the warts and all. And that sounds a little highfalutin, but I found that out with a story that published just a few days ago.
Talk to us about that. And for you folks can't see this, but he brought a stack, and we have a stack of. Being that he's a newspaper man, we got newspapers. Not digital copies, but the actual newspaper.
The real thing.
The real thing, right here.
Yeah, I saw a guy in a bar today reading a real newspaper, and I wanted to go up and kiss him.
Tell us about the story.
We call this story the story of the hero's grave. And it's something I've been looking for a long time. And the idea of newspapers being the rough draft of history is this story happened in 1908. and there's no one around from 1908 to tell me about this story. So I went digging in our archives and found them. The story.
The story.
Yeah. Not everything I wanted to find, but an awful lot, which gave you real feel for what happened in Jacksonville in 1908. And this gets to where stories come from. Mm-hmm. A cop called a friend of mine at the paper, Topher Sanders, and said, "Hey, Topher, I see this gravestone every day on my beat. It's in a part of town just next to the interstate near a park, and the gravestone is actually in a sidewalk. Like the sidewalk's been built around this tombstone, and then the actual raised concrete of this man's grave, as if somehow the words on the tombstone protected it from the indignities visited upon all these other graves nearby. It used to be a thriving African-American graveyard that was bulldozed over, and almost all the tombstones are gone, who knows where, except for this one, which they built a sidewalk around." Yeah. And it says, "This tablet marks the grave of Thompson Williams, a Negro who died on October 28th, 1908, while endeavoring to defend the life and honor of a white woman."
And that's what you had to start with.
Yeah, that's what I had to start with. So I had a date and I had a name, and I went looking. And in the archives of a couple of newspapers that published in Jacksonville, the Times-Union and the scrappy evening Metropolis, was able to put together this story of what happened that night. And what happened to Thompson Williams. And then the question of, journalism is curiosity. And I think a lot of what we're talking about, keeping your job fresh, is curiosity. Mm-hmm. I found actually that we'd done a couple of stories over the years, like in 1949 and 1985 on this very thing. But there was no...
On that?
On that tombstone. Because
really?
It's, you're going to pass it if you're in that part of town. But the stories were very perfunctory, just, one story said, "We don't know what happened." And the others had just that first day's reporting. But I kept digging, and it wasn't that hard, but I was curious. I wanted to know what happened, so I just kept looking, and I looked for weeks afterwards and was able to piece together something close to the entire story. I wasn't able to answer all my stories, but I was curious. I was really eager to know what happened back then.
Wow.
And so it became a fascinating story, I think, and readers seem to like it. So it's where that curiosity takes you, and I think if you're curious, that can liven up your job. If you're curious about what makes these things tick, it could apply to, I think, almost any job.
Yeah.
If you're interested and curious about it still. And that doesn't happen all the time. Some stories are boring. Some days are boring. Sure, some days, people listening to this they're bored. And some days at my work, I'm bored. But it's mostly on me, because when I'm bored, it's mostly on me, because I'm not always on fire.
Right.
Some days you're just kind of down, and there's nothing striking you in the head and saying this is a good story.
And it's interesting how that came about.
Yeah.
It is somebody calls somebody, and then
my friend told me, he said, "This sounds like a story you'd be interested in."
Yeah. So there's a little network there,
because
network. They know Topher knows what you like to write about or what you might want to write about. And you mentioned curiosity, and I had made a note on this that I had said to myself, I said, now Matt might not remember this, but a number of years ago, you had mentioned to me that when I think it was an intern or somebody new came into the newsroom, a student, thinking they want to be a journalist, and you could tell immediately or relatively quickly if she or he had the reporter instinct, and you said you looked for one thing, and it was curiosity. That they had to be asking questions. And it's interesting that you lead with that.
Yeah, funny, I don't recall talking to you about that, but it is so true.
And it stuck with me. I cannot tell you how many times I would mention that to students I had who wanted to go into journalism. I said, let me tell you, when one of the big-time writers here told me one time, and it's about the curiosity. And okay, now that you're generating ideas, and you mentioned that somebody in an office or a salesperson or a healthcare worker or a teacher, that you be curious about what's around you. Obviously you don't this one, someone came to you and said, "Hey Matt, you might be interested." Do you wait for curiosity? Do you wait for the event to happen? Do you wait for the lead? Or are you much more proactive on a regular basis?
Yeah, you have to be proactive. Sometimes you get great ideas, believe it or not, from publicists and PR people or someone at an agency. I had an email that I get hundreds of emails a day, and sometimes something will pop out.
recommending stories?
Yeah, recommending stories, or could you do a story on this, or, we're doing this event. And most have very little interest to, not necessarily just to me, but to readers. But sometimes something will pop out at you, like I got one about from a hospice, talking about a couple in hospice care, meaning they're weeks from death,
right,
who are getting married. So I said, I got to. That's what I'm doing this Saturday. So I went to their wedding. Okay.
Is that right?
Yeah, and sometimes you'll get a call. I got a call from a woman who called a former coworker of mine and said, "There's a gentleman here who was at the bridge in Selma in the 1960s when the state troopers turned them back."
Yeah.
And he was a hero on the bridge. He was a teenager, and he helped save this woman who'd been beaten. And this man wasn't looking for publicity, but she told me, she gave me his address. I didn't know how to reach him, so I went over there and just knocked on his door, told him who I was. He invited me in, very genial. We had this great conversation, which turned into a story. And my reporting style is, for these kind of stories anyway, for these profiles and feature stories, is a conversation, much like we're having today. I don't sit there with a bunch of prepared answers, prepared questions.
Right.
I may have a general idea of where I want to go, but I prefer a conversation.
Yeah.
But often you've got to go look for, I think this is probably true for any job, you've got to go look for your leads. One story that was very satisfying to me was, I'm a surfer. So I'm looking at the surf report, and I see a picture, and I say, "Hey, that's Dangerous Dad." And it's an old guy who surfs at the Jacksonville Beach Pier. And I remembered, hey, I did a story on him in 1990, I think it was. He was an old surfer then, 50, doesn't seem so old anymore. And I said, man, he's 70 years old now. So I called him up and said, hey, Ed. His name's Ed Romer. They call him Dangerous Dad because he takes off on this big board and cruises through all the surfers, kind of, they all scatter as he goes. He's a great guy, and there were rumors that he's got a big beard, still has a big beard. Rumors that he lived underneath the pier. People had conjured up all these images of him. In actuality, he was just a very gentle, modest guy. And I said, hey, Ed, do you remember me? And he goes, yeah, in fact, I'm standing in my kitchen looking at the story you did on me. It's on the wall, so that made me feel good. And I said, hey, you're 70 years old now, right? And you're still surfing? I wanted to come can I come talk to you again? And he said, yeah, that'd be great. But, my wife's going through some cancer right now. And can you, we need to deal with that. Can you call me back? And I was, oh, certainly, So I called him back a few months later, and she had died. And so I met him at the pier. He agreed to meet me at the pier. And what started out as just a story about an old surfer became a story of this guy and how he finds solace. He said he feels closer to God when he's sitting out at the end of the pier. Wow. And we sat there and talked about his life, and he talked about how much he missed his wife and how much she meant to him and how he didn't feel like surfing that day because the waves weren't very good. And then he goes, as we talked, he said, hey, I'm here. Let's paddle out. So I paddled out with him and talked with him some more out at the end of the pier. So it became a very special story, something that I thought would be sort of, regular became a really emotional, solid story.
Wow. That's powerful. That is a powerful story.
Yeah, and that kind of stuff. I'm lucky, and I get paid a whole ton of money, but I get to meet people like that, and they honor me with their stories.
And it has to come back to you at a certain level, in that you're not, as you said, you don't go in with a pad and say, okay, I got 6 questions. Because recently I had someone contact me who was interviewing somebody I know, and it was by email. They sent me 6 questions, answered the questions, and then the person was going to write the story. But you go in, it's almost like you suspended judgment going in. And it's, okay, I might go down this road, but if another one comes up that seems to be more interesting, I'll take that one. Am I on the right track with that?
Yeah, very much. I don't really go in with an agenda. I like to see where it goes, and I don't know how that might be applicable to people. It's just suspending judgment, seeing where you need to go with this client or with this person you're interviewing, or
the student
in front of you,
yeah.
And seeing where their story needs to go.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, everybody has a story.
Yeah.
Everybody has a story. As I understand, a little bit I think I understand about newspaper writing, you're given a certain number of inches or words that you have to do. Do you ever submit something to your editor and it comes back redlined? You didn't meet the space, or you didn't meet his or her idea of what you should have done?
We have creative conversations sometimes about with creative differences, but usually they're fairly small points. Or they'll tease me about writing too long, and sometimes I don't write, as long because that's what the story's worth. I've had a couple long stories recently, and they're fun to do, but it's harder to write short, believe it or not. To cut out. It's knowing what to leave out as well as what to include. You can't include everything.
Right.
And like with the gentleman from Selma, I focused 90% of that story on those days, those weeks there. Had to show a little bit to show how he got there. And then I had to show a little bit about him afterwards. And that's quite affecting too. But, you can't devote your whole, too much time to that, because then it's just a resuscitation of his life.
Right.
But he had some cool things because he was, after Selma, he was drafted and sent to Vietnam, this country that had deprived him, at least in some way, of liberties, was now sending him to Vietnam. And he said, after I got back from Vietnam, I just wanted to be by myself. I didn't want to bother anybody. I just wanted to live my life. And that's just what he did.
Just what he did.
But then he went back to Selma and marched with the country's first black president across that bridge. He was in that crowd marching with them. And the woman who he saved was now 104 years old. She was in a wheelchair right next to the president. She recently died, Miss Amelia Boynton Robinson. But so, these stories are just great, and they're out there. And in every community, there's stories. Yeah. And so maybe it's finding out these people's stories, the student's story, the client's story, the subject of your story, their story. Find out what it is about them.
Yeah.
And give them, the space to open up about that.
Well, and part of what you said earlier, you said if it's a boring day or I'm bored, it's on me.
It is on me, yeah. I've had a couple boring days, actually, because that big story on the hero's grave ran, and I'm having a bit of a letdown after that, because I've been working on that for more than a year. And so I got to office Monday and
really? More than a year on that?
Yeah. I would just, it came up, and then I had some circumstances where I couldn't finish the story, and I wanted to time it to October, which is when it happened. So I set it aside, and it was in my, tickler file. And then when September came around, I started on it again.
Wow.
So, it's been kind of percolating for a while. Most I don't have the luxury of that.
There has to be a discipline in what you do as well. I would have to think, that you know what you need to. I'm assuming there are deadlines at times.
Oh, yeah.
You've got to have something done at a certain time. This one you were allowed to, or able to, let it, as you said, percolate for about a year.
Yeah.
Again, you have to have the discipline to go back to it.
Yeah, you do. And I have to say I'm very lucky because, I did the daily news reporting stuff, and now I'm in a position where my editors have entrusted me with this more free-form sort of job, and I'm very grateful to them for that. I think I've earned their trust, but it's still being granted that trust is also very important. So I'm in a good place right now. I've been doing this 30-some years, so 33 years.
Well, and that's interesting. I think that point of trust, that in my travels, sometimes I hear people complaining, and sometimes they got reason to about their position, where they are, their situation, career-wise. And sometimes it's because there is a lack of trust. I want more freedom. Well, it sounds like maybe you haven't shown that you can handle that kind of freedom to your supervisor or what have you. And we all want to have that great supervisor, but the supervisor wants to have the great follower doing what he or she's supposed to be doing.
Oh, sure. It's very important.
Yeah. What our listeners might not know, at least many of them, you're an accomplished musician. Guitar, ukulele, mandolin, right?
Getting there.
Yeah, getting there, right?
It's a new challenge.
Yeah, and as a little aside, if any of you were to listen to my first CD, which I think sold 6 copies, maybe
yes,
6,
awesome.
maybe 7, the first CD called Same Tune, Different Song, on my song Coconuts in Love with You, you will hear the sweet renderings of a great ukulele. And that is Matt Soergel throughout the entire song. Just wonderful.
I think you paid me $20 or something for that.
25 now. Come on.
Oh yeah, okay, sorry. So now I list on my resume professional ukuleleist.
Does that help you stay fresh?
I think it does. Yeah, you need to have outside passions that keep you going.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just be a drone. Yeah, nice. When I can, I try to surf in the morning, which I'm lucky to do, living near the beach.
Mm-hmm.
And but it's not just luck. I kind of wanted to live near the coast to be able to do that, and so that kind of limited my job field somewhat. But I didn't want to just move from city to city wherever they sent me to do my job.
Yeah,
and perhaps it's not the best thing for my career, in the scheme of things. But I'm happy with the choices I made, which they are choices you make.
That's right. Yeah, they are the choices, and it's about a whole life. We don't live fractional lives, and I think maybe sometimes that's what happens with some folks. They get fractionalized, and you're saying, part of my day is going to be on that paddleboard, and part of that day is going to be with the ukulele, and part of that, your balance might be a cliche, but it sounds like.
And I think it makes your professional life easier to bear and more creative and more satisfying.
I would think it's richer.
Yeah.
And I would think you are richer, and the products you do are richer as a result. When you were at the earlier in the paper, your years at the Florida Times-Union, you were the movie critic.
Yeah, I got lucky there. I did that for about 14 years.
14 years.
Yeah,
so you got paid to go watch movies.
I did, yeah. And
how many a week were you doing?
3 to 5 usually.
Wow.
And then I did other stories as well, feature stories as well. And that was lucky because it kept me going. 'Cause this is a tough career to age in, because especially as a writer, because you run out of inspiration. Every day you're starting fresh. And on this job that I'm doing now, every day I'm starting fresh and trying to find new things. When you have a beat like the movies, I had some structure built in through a critical part of my career and was able to sort of enjoy that structure. So maybe like structure, I was painting this picture earlier of this freedom that I have. Mm-hmm. Well, the freedom is kind of terrifying too, because you've got to, keep finding new things.
Yeah.
But when you have some structure, it let me kind of settle in and do that job while I was raising my kids and making a living, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed diving down into that sort of micro world,
right.
Of film.
And it's been a few years since you've done that now,
a few years, yeah.
As I recall, you weren't one of those critics who was always slamming. I mean, you were positive in your writing as well.
Yeah, I had some slams, but I tried to approach it like, what is this film trying to do? What is this movie trying to do? And who are they trying to reach? And if they reach that, then I wasn't afraid to give it a good review.
Yeah.
But I gave it some slams too, and I got some complaints from people. How come you didn't like this movie? How come you, And I tried to say there's no right or wrong opinion. Well, sometimes there is.
As we move toward the end today with the conversation, this might put you on the spot. Maybe you can't come up with the answer right now, but your most intriguing piece?
There have been a few, but the one that I really liked was set right here in Atlantic Beach, which was the author of one of my favorite books from childhood, which is still read today, Pat Frank, who wrote Alas, Babylon, which is about a small town in North Florida after a nuclear war. Oh. It was written in 1959. And I'd always heard that he'd worked at the Jacksonville Journal, which is our now defunct afternoon paper. Right. And I went looking for Pat Frank and couldn't find him because he wrote under a different name at the Journal. But I eventually found him. I found a rare autobiography that he'd written. Well, not really an autobiography, but some essays about life, and in which he talked about Jacksonville and writing Alas, Babylon. I found his brother. Wow. I found his half-sister. I found his children and wrote the story about the author of this book, which is still being widely read in high schools, called Alas, Babylon. It's a wonderful book. And I was able to paint this picture of this guy who had his issues. He was an alcoholic and a womanizer, but also a very charming, brilliant, bright man who had this incredible life, a part of which revolved around right at the end of 6th Street, Atlantic Beach, where he had a house, and he used to tell these stories about catching sharks by driving down the beach in a Model T with a rope tied to a chicken flapping in the water, and the chicken would come up and grab it, and they'd pull it up. I mean, so he really was a part of this community.
Yeah.
And so I had that tie to him, and for the 50th anniversary of the book, I said, I want to find out about Pat Frank. And
You're part detective, Matt.
Partly, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And they're talking about the 6th Street, which is just right here.
Yeah.
Right?
Right down the road.
Yes, it's the road that my wife and I walk up to the beach all the time.
There you go.
Yeah, wow.
So stories are right under your nose.
Yeah, they are. And I think if tying it back into folks who aren't the writers and the resilience and the growth and professional development is that there were things right under our noses. And it's up to us to find it. It's great if you got a mentor and you've got some sort of a support system, but if you don't.
Yeah. And you'll miss some things, too. I see some things go right by me, and it's only after they're gone that I slap my forehead and go, "Duh!" Or somebody else does it, or it's just gone, and it's never going to come back.
One last question, and then I want you to give a challenge out to the people listening. Most significant accomplishment for Matt Soergel as a writer to date?
Well, maybe it goes back to that guy, Dangerous Dad, who had the picture, had the story on his kitchen wall. When I do a story, then move on. But I affect, the people who I did the story about, that's maybe their 15 minutes of fame.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's not good either. Sometimes stories aren't complimentary, and, we have we're not licensed. Journalists aren't licensed. They're not given any sort of special. Well, there's some special franchises, but you're just a person, and you're dealing with somebody, but you have to deal with them honorably. And if you do, you've done your job.
Wow.
And that applies, I guess, to all this. So I do a story on somebody, and it's hanging on their wall. That's a pretty significant accomplishment.
Yeah, that's cool. You're making a difference in that person's life. You're making a difference in the community. I mean, people know in this community. People know Matt Soergel. I mean, they know you from what you write, and you're there on the front page on a regular basis. And so I thank you for that. That is that's a cool thing. It's a great legacy. It's a great legacy.
It's a real honor.
And that I love that you say that, because I was also hearing integrity in there. You mentioned trust, and it's really about being fair to the subject. And like at times, the fairness is that it's not that complimentary, but it's fair.
Yeah.
And so many times, and I think in our public discourse, that's missing the honor, the integrity, and the fairness.
Yeah.
It is degenerated. Sometimes it degenerates into who's yelling the loudest, and that's a shame. And you don't do that. That's why it's so positive. When you see a Matt Soergel story, it's going to tug at the heart. It's going to make you laugh. It's going to make you cry. But it's going to make a difference in a positive way.
Well, thanks.
And I think that's a great legacy. So, and we've been going to this along the way as we close it. For the person who is the office worker, the teacher, the healthcare worker, whomever, not a writer, and they're having those bad days, those days of there's no inspiration. What would you say to them? And I know that you're not a doctor, you're not a nurse, you're not a teacher, so to speak. But what would you say to them? What would be your advice? Your one or two or three things to say? Don't forget this.
I'm not sure if I have any magic answers, but just I think everybody in every transaction in their life, every interaction in their life, you're affecting somebody else. So. I think a lot of people, what's that line, lead lives of quiet despair.
Yeah.
Desperation, quiet desperation. I think it's because people don't feel valued, or they don't feel like they're making a difference. But you are making a difference. Even if you're nice to the person at the gas station, you're making a difference.
Yes.
So in your job as a teacher, you're affecting kids. Your job as an office worker, you're affecting the people around you, your clients, your customers. your bosses, your company. You are making a difference. And I think a lot of people, where dissatisfaction in a job comes from feeling like nobody notices or that you're not making a difference. And how frustrating would that be? But I think everybody's making a difference.
Yeah.
I was at a Mexican restaurant, and the girl behind the counter was so nice. She made a difference in my life.
Yeah.
She was just so cool.
Yeah. And just saying thank you to that person sometimes. Yeah, and I think that's one of those things we can do, and it sounds trite, it sounds cliche, but on those really, really terrible days that we have, in whatever our calling is this sitting down. And there was something I used to share with my students, and it's not novel to me. I read about it someplace, but it's and I just called it 3 good things. And I said, before you go to bed, what are 3 good things that happened in the last 24 hours that either you did, happened to you, or you saw? What difference did you make, even if it was on a very small level? And the idea, I was writing some notes here all over the place, but I'm hearing you mention every interaction you're making a difference, or the potential to make a difference.
Potential.
Yeah, the potential. The curiosity. Keep your eyes open. There are opportunities for you. And again, it could be small, but the potential. Building trust. And then you said, every day you're starting fresh. You have that great article, but then it's
a blank page the next day.
Now I got to start again. And I think that's power. And I think that also can be it can be scary. Oh gosh, what happens if I'm dry? But it also is liberating. I get to do it again. I used to love the beginning of every semester because I made mistakes the last semester. Now this semester is new. It's a blank slate for me. I used to love that. So again, thanks, Matt. We appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Steve.
This has been great. And thank you, listeners. Without you, there's no Growth and Resilience Network. Visit my website, stevepiscitelli.com, for more information about upcoming conversations and about programs coming up. I've got some real good ones. I'm still nailing down the guests, but it looks like we might get a personal trainer in here in the very near future. Looks like we're going to have somebody talk to us maybe about resilience of a community, not just resilience of our own spirit. So we got a lot coming up at the end of this year and the beginning of 2016. So until we meet again, either virtually, online, or somewhere in person around this great nation, this is Steve Piscitelli from my world headquarters here in Atlantic Beach, Florida, reminding us all to choose well, live well, and be well. And one more time, go to Jacksonville.com and check out Matt Soergel. Bye-bye, folks.